Hey folks, I know I'm just some strange guy telling stories, but before we start, leave a like and subscribe. Let's dive into today's story. Disclaimer: the content in this video is purely for entertainment purposes. The theories and stories here are speculative and are not backed by evidence. Viewer discretion is advised. I wasn't desperate for money, yet rent was overdue, bills stacked up, and side hustles just weren't cutting it. Then I found an offer on a sketchy dark web forum. 10 grand for one night of live streaming in an abandoned hotel. 6 hours, they said. No cutting the feed, no edits, stay until sunrise, and the money's mine. The Bellevue Hotel was infamous in town, closed for over 20 years after a series of incidents. Disappearances, accidents, some say it's cursed. I didn't care about curses. I just needed the cash. On the night of, I drove out to that place, packed with chargers, my flashlight clipped to my jacket. The Bellevue sat alone, off an old forgotten highway, cracked parking lot, weeds everywhere. A building from another time, slowly rotting away. I started the stream. "Welcome to the Bellevue," I whispered. "Let's see what all the fuss is about." Inside, it smelled of dust and mildew, and something metallic. The chat chimed in. User Haunted Spectre 3. "Don't stray too far from the entrance, friend. Take it easy. You don't want to wake them up. Trolls, I thought, just trying to scare me." But then, as I stepped further inside, the entrance door slammed shut. I spun around, tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. Panic prickled at the edges of my mind, but I kept it together. My viewers were eating it up. I moved through the hotel, showing the old dining room, the dusty bar. The whole time, cryptic messages kept flooding in. User Shadow Gazer, check the mirrors. I lifted my phone to the cracked mirror behind the bar, and for a split second, I saw a shadow right behind me. But when I turned around, nothing, just empty silence. Every step I took, the air seemed to grow thicker. The lights flickered more and more, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and breathe. The chat grew frantic. "User Haunted Spectre, the lights go out." Then, footsteps. Behind me, I whipped around, my flashlight catching nothing but peeling wallpaper. My heart pounded, but I forced a laugh. "All right, who's messing with me?" Nothing. I made it to the ballroom. The grand piano sat in the corner, gathering dust. And in the far corner of the room, just beyond the light, a figure, tall and still like a shadow that didn't belong. I zoomed in, and the chat went wild. "You need to leave. Now. It's awake." I stepped back. The lights dimmed. My heart raced as I checked my battery. 58%. The figure stood there, waiting, its dark silhouette watching. Then a message appeared in the chat. "User Haunted Spectre, stay in the light. If it goes out, it can't touch you." That was when I knew. I was not alone in the Bellevue, and I wasn't getting out until sunrise, if I survived that long. I stood frozen, my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure in the corner of the ballroom remained perfectly still, as if it was waiting for something I hadn't figured out yet. My viewers kept spamming the chat with warnings. "Don't get too close. Whatever happens, don't let it out of your sight." But it was obvious now. I was trapped, locked in a decaying hotel with something unnatural. I took a step backward, carefully staying within the flickering glow of the overhead light. The ballroom stretched in every direction, and the weak light didn't reach all the corners. My mind raced through options. If I stayed put, I'd run out of battery. If I moved, I might end up in total darkness. Neither felt like a winning plan. As I scanned the room for an exit, the chat chimed in again. "User Watcher 77, there's a way out, but you have to find the room with the red door." "Haunted Spectre 23, keep the light steady. It reacts to movement." I took slow breaths, trying to keep my hand from shaking. There was no way I'd survive without light, and my battery was ticking down faster than I liked. I needed to think, and fast. I flicked the camera back toward the far corner to see if the figure had moved. It hadn't, at least not yet. But then something new happened, something subtle that made my skin crawl. From somewhere deep within the hotel, I heard a faint click, like the sound of a door unlocking. The chat noticed too. "User Shadowed Gazer, that's your signal. You have to move now." My flashlight swayed as I spun toward the ballroom exit, sweeping over dusty tables and peeling wallpaper. I didn't want to stay in this room any longer than I had to. The figure in the shadows might not have moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't stay still forever. Just before I slipped out of the ballroom, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement behind me. I aimed my camera back toward the shadowed corner, and my viewers exploded in chat. User, Haunted Spectre 23, it's behind you! I almost dropped my phone. I whipped around, expecting to see the figure inches from my face, but there was nothing. Just an empty hallway. Whatever it was, it hadn't followed me. Yet, with my heart pounding, I stepped into the hallway, where the ceiling lights flickered with every step I took. Somewhere nearby, I heard another faint click, a second door unlocking. It was like the hotel was leading me somewhere. I glanced at my battery, 43%. I was burning through power faster than I'd hoped. I had to make a decision: wander aimlessly through the hallways until my phone died, or follow the sound of those clicks. The chat was divided, half of them begging me to stay put and wait for sunrise, the other half telling me to keep moving. User, Watcher77, follow the sound. That's how it works. I didn't have much of a choice. I picked the hallway to my right, heading toward the direction of the last click. The floor creaked under my weight, and I could hear the distant hum of pipes rattling through the walls. As I moved deeper into the hotel, the hallways grew narrower and the air colder. Then I saw it, a red door. It was tucked at the end of a side corridor, almost hidden behind a curtain of cobwebs. The paint was chipped, and the doorknob looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But it was the only door I'd seen that wasn't locked or blocked off. User, Shadow Gazer, go inside. It's the only way. I hesitated. Something about the door made me feel uneasy, like I was stepping into a trap. But what choice did I have? The lights were flickering more violently now, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they gave out completely. I reached for the knob and twisted it. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. There was nothing inside except a single chair and a mirror leaning against the far wall. I stepped in cautiously, keeping my flashlight steady as I scanned the room for any signs of movement. Then, the door slammed shut behind me. I jumped, spinning toward the door. I jiggled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked again. My viewers flooded the chat with panicked messages. User, Watcher77, stay calm. Don't look away from the mirror. I didn't understand what they meant at first, but when I turned back toward the mirror, I saw it. A figure standing directly behind me, just out of reach of the light. It wasn't the same as the one in the ballroom. This one was smaller, more human-like, but its features were blurred, like someone trying to remember a dream that was slipping away. I kept the phone camera trained on the mirror, making sure my viewers could see what I saw. User, Shadow Gazer, it's testing you. Don't turn around. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but I felt a weight in the room, like it was waiting for me to make a mistake. My hand tightened around my phone, and I glanced at the battery, 29%. I had no idea what would happen if the light died, and I wasn't about to find out. The figure stood perfectly still, watching me, or at least watching my reflection. I slowly backed toward the door, keeping my eyes locked on the mirror the whole time. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. I stumbled, nearly dropping my phone as I tried to keep the flashlight steady. My viewers went wild in the chat, spamming everything from warnings to prayers. User, Watcher77, you need to get out. Now! I tried the door again, pulling and yanking with all my strength. It didn't budge. Meanwhile, the figure in the mirror took another step forward, closing the gap between us. Then I noticed something strange. The light from my flashlight wasn't reflecting properly in the mirror. Instead of bouncing off the glass, the light seemed to disappear the closer it got to the figure. It was like the shadow was absorbing it. User, Haunted Spectre 23, time's running out. My battery was down to 18%. The shadows were creeping closer. I knew I had to make a move, but every instinct told me that turning my back on the figure would be a mistake. I stayed facing the mirror, inching slowly toward the door. And then, click, the door unlocked. Without thinking, I threw it open and bolted into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. The lights flickered wildly, and for a moment I thought they were going to go out completely. But somehow, they held, just barely. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My phone buzzed with new messages from the chat. User, Shadowed Gazer. It's not over yet. Keep moving. I checked my battery, 12%. There was no way I was making it to sunrise with this much power left, but I had to try. The hotel was alive, and the shadows weren't going to let me leave without a fight. The moment I stepped into the light, the room felt wrong, like stepping through a curtain into another world. My phone screen glitched, static lines cutting through the video feed. For a brief second, everything went silent. The hum stopped, the chat froze, and the air itself seemed still. Then, all at once, the light in the room dimmed, just enough to cast faint shadows at the edges of the walls. That was when I realized something horrifying. The other me hadn't disappeared. He stood just outside the light now, in the growing darkness, his grin stretching wider than before. The chat exploded with messages. User Haunt Spectre, you don't have much time. Keep moving. The light is safe, for now. My reflection, or whatever it was, remained at the edge of the shadows, watching. There was no aggression, no malice, just a calm, eerie patience, like it was waiting for its moment. It tilted its head slightly, almost as if to say, "You'll have to leave the light eventually." I swallowed hard and checked my battery, 2%. Not enough to stream much longer. I had maybe a few minutes before everything went dark. The chat kept buzzing, urging me to move. I knew I had to make a decision, stay where the light was steady but shrinking, or push forward and hope to find a way out. I decided to keep moving. The white room had no visible doors or windows, but as I walked deeper, I noticed the floor sloping slightly downward. It wasn't a steep slope, just enough to make me feel like I was heading somewhere, lower, somewhere hidden. My phone flickered and the screen dimmed, but the stream continued. I could see the viewer count ticking upward. There were more people watching now. Hundreds, maybe thousands. A cold realization hit me. Whoever was running this stream, they'd planned it all along. The viewers weren't just watching me survive the night. They were watching something else. Don't look behind you. I didn't need to be told twice. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the faint light that still clung to the edges of the walls. My phone buzzed with more chat messages, the words scrolling too fast to read. I caught glimpses. Almost there. Don't stop. They're waiting. And then I saw it. A door at the bottom of the sloping room. This one wasn't like the red or black doors from before. It was wooden, plain, and slightly cracked, as if it had been used many times. Warm light leaked from the gap underneath, flickering like candlelight. I knew I had no other option. I reached for the handle, pushing the door open with a slow creak. The room beyond was small, cozy even, with walls lined in dark wood and shelves filled with old books. A single candle burned on a wooden table in the center. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The moment I did, the buzzing hum stopped. Silence filled the room. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. And something else, a whisper, faint, just at the edge of hearing. I held my phone up to catch the sound, hoping the stream could pick it up too. The chat was moving slower now, the viewers waiting to see what would happen next. The whisper grew louder, not like a voice, but like the sound of wind moving through cracks in the wall. Then, the candle on the table flickered, and the shadows in the room shifted. They weren't random shadows. They moved with purpose, sliding across the walls toward me. I could feel it now. Whatever was in the hotel, it wasn't just watching. It was waiting for me to run out of light. My phone buzzed one last time, 1% battery. The candle's flame flickered again, shrinking lower. The shadows crept closer, stretching long and thin across the floor. I knew if the light went out completely, I wouldn't be able to stop whatever was hiding in them. Then, out of nowhere, a new message appeared on the stream. User Haunted Spectre. Take the candle. It's your only chance. I grabbed the candle without thinking, holding it steady as the flame wavered. The tiny glow wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the shadows at bay for now. I checked my phone again. 0% battery. The stream cut out. The screen went black. For a moment, everything felt suspended. Just me, the candle, and the dark, creeping shadows all around. And then I heard it, a door unlocking somewhere nearby. The first real night in the lighthouse was unsettling, to say the least. I woke up to the sound of the waves slamming against the rocks, each crash heavier than the last, as if the ocean was pushing closer and closer. The walls groaned. as if the whole building was tired of holding itself up after all these years. That morning, I decided to focus on the practical stuff. Basic repairs, cleaning. The place was a wreck, and there was no point in getting worked up over the eerie vibe just yet. Figured old places like this always felt strange, until you got used to them. I swept out the dust, tightened some bolts on the doors, covered cracked windows with plastic to keep the wind out, just the basics. But then, I opened one of the cabinets near the base of the tower and found something unusual. Inside was a second logbook, smaller, far more worn than the one I'd found the night before. Its pages were damp, crumpled, ink smeared in places, but I could still read most of it. And tucked between the pages was a brittle, yellowed map, hand-drawn with strange symbols scattered across it. At the bottom, in faded ink, was a single word, below. I didn't know what to make of it, but it made me curious. Below. Was there a basement? A hidden room? I hadn't seen anything like that so far, but the idea of a hidden part of the tower was both thrilling and unsettling. I spent the rest of the day scouring every inch of the lower floors, tapping on walls, prying up loose floorboards, hoping to find some hidden hatch. And finally, I did. Beneath a ragged old rug in the storage room, there was a small metal latch, half rusted and nearly invisible. I knelt down, wiped the grime away, and pulled the hatch open. A narrow wooden ladder led down into darkness. The air below was thick with the smell of salt and damp wood. I stood there, debating whether I should go down. Something about the space felt wrong. Not dangerous, exactly. Just old, in a way that made me uneasy. But curiosity won, and I grabbed my flashlight, climbing down the ladder. The space beneath the lighthouse wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a basement or a storage area. It was a tunnel, roughly carved from stone, leading deeper toward the ocean. The walls were slick with moisture, and strange markings were scratched into the stone. Curved lines, spirals, almost like waves. I walked carefully, my footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The air felt heavier the further I went, as if the tunnel itself was pressing down on me. Eventually, the passage opened into a small cavern, and in the center of the room, I saw something I didn't expect. A large stone basin, filled to the brim with seawater, though there was no sign of how the water got there. Carved into the rim of the basin were more of those strange symbols, spirals, wave patterns, almost hypnotic. And next to the basin was a metal lantern, long extinguished, thick with rust. But then there was the statue, a crude figure carved from stone, half human, half something else. Its face was elongated with deep-set eyes and a mouth curved into an unsettling grin. Tentacle-like shapes sprouted from its arms, curling around its torso as if to pull it down into the depths. The whole thing gave off a feeling of oldness, like it had been forgotten for centuries, waiting in silence beneath the earth. I shone my flashlight around the cavern, but there was nothing else. Just the basin, the statue, and the lingering smell of salt. I couldn't shake the feeling that the space was meant for something, some kind of ritual or offering. The markings, the water, the figure, it all felt deliberate, like someone had placed them there with purpose. As I stared at the basin, I noticed something strange. The water inside was perfectly still. Not a ripple, not a wave. Almost as if the water wasn't water at all, but something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. I backed away slowly, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. Whatever this place was, it was old. Older than the lighthouse itself. Maybe older than the shoreline above. I made my way back up the ladder, shutting the hatch firmly behind me. Something about that cavern felt unfinished, like I had interrupted something that was never meant to be disturbed. That night, as I sat by the small wood stove listening to the tide, the waves crashed harder than before. And for a moment, I thought I heard something beneath the sound. Like a deep hum, almost like a voice. Not words exactly, just a low, rhythmic noise, rising and falling with the waves. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or the ocean, but something about it felt directed. As if the sound wasn't random at all. It was almost like the tide was calling out, waiting for someone to answer. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the statue in the cavern, its strange grin etched into the stone, and that single word on the map, below. What was beneath the lighthouse? And more importantly, what was it waiting for? I woke the next morning with a knot in my stomach. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie calm outside the lighthouse. It was one of those mornings where everything felt still, too still. No birds, no distant sound of boats, just the heavy, repetitive swell of the ocean, rising and falling like a breath. I tried to shake off the feeling and decided to explore the upper floors I hadn't fully checked yet. The staircase to the top of the lighthouse creaked under my weight as I climbed, and the lantern room at the peak greeted me with the same dim, fogged windows from the day before. A rusty old lens sat in the center of the room, its mechanism frozen with time. I gave it a push out of habit, but it didn't budge. I figured fixing the light might be a good project for later, something to keep me busy and away from unsettling thoughts about the cavern below. As I turned to leave the lantern room, my foot kicked something small and metallic, a pocket watch. I knelt down and picked it up, wiping away a layer of dust. It looked antique, with delicate engravings along the edges and a cracked glass cover. When I flipped it over, I saw the initials EH scratched roughly into the metal. Captain Ellis Hargrove. This must have been his. For a moment, I felt a strange connection to the man who had written the logbook. It was hard not to imagine him standing where I was now, staring out at the endless waves. What had he seen? What had he heard in those final days before he vanished? I slipped the watch into my jacket pocket and made my way back down the spiral staircase. I tried not to let my mind wander, but something was bothering me. The tide had risen unusually high overnight, almost reaching the rocky path leading up to the lighthouse door. And it wasn't just the tide. The shoreline itself looked different, as if the sea had rearranged the rocks and sand while I slept. It felt as if the ocean was inching closer, little by little. Later that afternoon, I returned to the logbook, hoping to find something I'd missed. I skimmed the pages again, stopping at the final entry. "I made a mistake," Ellis had written. "The sea saw me. It had been gnawing at me. This idea that the ocean could see, that it could want something. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses. But the way Ellis wrote about the tide, the way he described it as knowing and deliberate, it was enough to make anyone uncomfortable." Then I noticed a detail I'd missed before. In the margin of the final entry, there was a scribbled note, half faded but still legible. "When the lantern goes out, the keeper must return." I stared at those words, trying to make sense of them. The lantern, the one in the tower, it hadn't worked for decades, as far as I could tell. And what did he mean by the keeper must return? Was he talking about himself, or was there something else he expected to come back? The thought unsettled me more than I cared to admit, so I decided to busy myself with some practical work. I spent the next few hours clearing out the storage room and organizing some of the old supplies I'd found scattered throughout the place. It was mostly junk, rusty tools, cracked lanterns, and frayed rope. But tucked beneath a pile of broken equipment, I found something useful, a leather-bound journal, worn at the edges. The journal didn't belong to Captain Ellis. The name scrawled inside the cover was Michael O'Hara, a name I didn't recognize. As I flipped through the pages, I realized this journal was much newer than the logbook, probably from the 1970s based on the handwriting and style. O'Hara had been another keeper, someone who had tried to maintain the lighthouse long after Ellis had disappeared. His entry started out mundane like Ellis's, notes about weather conditions, ship traffic, and daily tasks. But just like before, the tone shifted the longer he stayed. March 22nd, 1971. The light went out last night. I checked the wiring, but nothing seems broken. It feels as if the lantern doesn't want to work, like it knows something I don't. April 5th, 1971. There's something in the water. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. Just a shape moving beneath the surface. I thought it was a whale at first, but whales don't stay that close to shore, and they don't stay still. Whatever it was waiting. April 17th, 1901. The tide keeps rising. I've done everything I can, but it's no use. It knows the lantern is out. It knows I don't belong here. I have to leave before it comes back. I don't want to end up like Ellis. That was the last entry. O'Hara had abandoned the lighthouse soon after writing it, judging by the journal's abrupt end. I closed the book slowly, a creeping realization settling over me. Both Ellis and O'Hara had talked about the lantern going out and the consequences of it staying dark for too long. Both men seemed to believe the lighthouse was more than just a beacon for passing ships. It was something else entirely. I stood there, holding the journal in my hands, listening to the distant crash of the tide. For the first time since I arrived, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake by coming here. Not because the place was haunted or cursed, but because I had unknowingly taken on a responsibility I didn't understand. The lantern wasn't just a light, it was a warning, and without it, something beneath the sea was stirring. That night, I tried to get the lantern working. I spent hours fiddling with the gears and wiring, but no matter what I did, the light refused to come on. The metal groaned under my touch, rust flaking away with every turn of the wrench, as if the lighthouse itself was resisting my efforts. And then, the tide rose again. I stood at the window, watching as the waves climbed higher than they ever had before, creeping dangerously close to the edge of the lighthouse grounds. The water swirled and churned, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. Just a flicker of movement beneath the surface. A dark shape, too large and too deliberate to be a trick of the light. The ocean was waiting, and it wasn't going to wait much longer. With the candle flickering weakly in my hand, I stood in the center of that cramped wooden room, listening as the faint click of another door unlocking echoed through the walls. I glanced around, but there was no obvious way out. No visible door, window, or crack in the walls, just the shifting shadows creeping closer with every flicker of the flame. I knew the candle wouldn't last long. Every second, the wick burned lower, the light dimmed slightly, and the shadows grew bolder. Then I noticed it, a small hatch in the corner of the floor, hidden beneath an old rug. I knelt down, keeping the candle steady, and yanked the rug away. Sure enough, a wooden hatch with a metal handle stared back at me. The chat might have been gone, but the warnings from before echoed in my head. Don't let the light go out. Keep moving. The candle flickered again. I had no choice. I grabbed the metal handle and heaved the hatch open, revealing a narrow ladder leading down into darkness. A cold breeze wafted up from below, making the flame dance dangerously close to snuffing out. Holding the candle with one hand, I climbed down the ladder as quickly as I could. The wooden rungs groaned under my weight, but I pressed on. Below me, the space opened into another hallway, this one smaller and tighter than the others. The moment my feet hit the ground, I heard it. Soft footsteps coming from the dark corridor ahead. I held the candle out, trying to push the shadows back, but they only retreated slightly. I could feel the presence of something just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't moving quickly, just slow, deliberate steps, like it had all the time in the world. Then I saw them, figures standing just beyond the light, silent and still. There were 3 of them, motionless in the dark. They weren't like the doppelganger I'd seen earlier. These figures were tall and thin, with long limbs and faces too blurred to make out. They stood perfectly still, as if waiting for me to make a decision. I realized with a sinking feeling that the light was the only thing keeping them from stepping closer. I needed to move, and fast. There was only one way to go, forward, down the narrow corridor. With the candle in hand, I pressed on, doing my best to ignore the figures standing just out of reach. Their presence weighed on me, like a pressure building in the air. The corridor twisted and turned, leading deeper into the hotel. I could feel the floor sloping downward again, as if the entire building had been built to funnel anyone foolish enough to enter toward one inevitable place. Finally, the corridor opened into a large, circular room. In the center stood a massive, rusted iron door, covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize, but that felt ancient. Without thinking, I approached the door. The candle was burning dangerously low now, the flame no larger than a pinprick. I knew I didn't have much time left before it went out completely. Then I noticed something strange. The door wasn't locked. It was slightly ajar, just enough for me to push it open with my free hand. As the door creaked open, I was hit with a gust of warm air, fresh air, the kind you only feel outside. For the first time, I dared to hope that I might actually make it out. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase leading upward, toward what looked like a hatch at the top. I didn't hesitate. I climbed the stairs as quickly as I could, the candle flickering wildly in my hand. When I reached the top, I pushed it open and found myself outside. The cold night air hit me like a wave, and I gasped, filling my lungs with the freshest breath I'd taken all night. I crawled out of the hatch and collapsed on the ground, clutching the nearly spent candle. I looked around. I was in the overgrown courtyard at the back of the Bellevue Hotel. The building loomed behind me, dark and silent, as if none of it had ever happened. The chat was still down, my phone dead in my pocket, and wouldn't have shown me anything even if it worked. I was alone, or so I thought. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned, and there, standing in the shadows of the courtyard, was the doppelganger. He stood just at the edge of the light from the moon, watching me with that same eerie smile. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, waiting. And then, slowly, he raised his hand and waved. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but before I could react, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows of the hotel. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the spot where he'd been. Then I forced myself to my feet and stumbled toward my car, parked just beyond the rusted gate. I never streamed on the dark web again, and I've never been back to the Bellevue Hotel. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm scrolling through random videos or browsing obscure forums, I'll see something familiar, a dark figure standing just out of sight, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time before light runs out for good. I've always had a thing for weird auctions, especially those tucked away in the corners of the internet. Not exactly the dark web, but close enough. One of those sketchy auction sites where you could snag old signs from abandoned hospitals, ghost town memorabilia, or weird trinkets people claimed were cursed. Usually it was harmless junk. But then I found the lighthouse. At first, it didn't even seem real. The listing said, "Own a historic lighthouse. Remote location, untouched since 1932. There were a few blurry photos, a tower of white brick streaked with moss, and a circular lantern room on top. The auction description gave no real details, just a vague promise of unmatched ocean views and untapped potential for renovation. I laughed to myself, thinking, who in their right mind would sell a lighthouse online? Then I saw the price. No one had placed a bid. It was sitting there at $3,000, about the same as a used car. I knew it was stupid, but the idea of owning a piece of history, something so unique, was hard to resist. The thought of escaping the monotony of city life and living by the sea sounded almost poetic. I hit bid now, not expecting anything. To my surprise, I won. A week later, a courier dropped off a single manila envelope with a key inside and a handwritten note with directions. The paper looked old, crinkled, and stained around the edges, as if it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. I ran my fingers over the faded ink. Welcome to your new home. Be mindful of the tide. No name, no signature, just that eerie little message. It took another 2 weeks to sort out my affairs, throw some essentials into my car, and make the drive to the lighthouse. The directions were vague, to put it lightly. I wound through narrow coastal roads, following signs that led further from civilization and deeper into the kind of wilderness people forget about. Trees thick as walls lined the path. My GPS quit an hour in, so I had to rely on the hand-drawn map from the envelope. Eventually the road ended, and there it was. The lighthouse stood on a small rise, battered by wind and salt, looming against a sky that looked ready to burst into a storm. It felt oddly grand and ancient, as if it had no business standing in the modern world. The air smelled sharply of the ocean, and waves crashed violently against the rocks below. For a moment, I just stood there, looking up at my new home. It was strange how silent it felt, despite the roar of the waves, like the world had emptied out, leaving only me in this relic. Something about that silence unsettled me. It wasn't the kind of peace I'd imagined. The front door was heavy, the kind that groaned when you pushed it open. I stepped inside, and it was clear no one had lived there for a very long time. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and dust floated lazily in the stale air. Old furniture covered in sheets crowded the small rooms at the base. The walls were lined with black and white photos, mostly of ships and long-forgotten sea captains. There was a strange sense of abandonment, like someone had left in a hurry, but never expected to come back. After I explored the lower floors, I made my way up the spiral staircase that wound through the tower. Each step echoed, the sound bouncing off the stone walls. At the top, I pushed open the heavy metal door to the lantern room. The glass windows were fogged with grime, but even through the haze, the view was breathtaking. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, dark and churning, as if the sea was alive with secrets. I should have felt excited. I should have felt victorious. Instead, all I could think about was how off everything felt. There was no electricity, no running water, just a lighthouse, frozen in time, waiting for something or someone. I found the first logbook that night, tucked away in a drawer near the entrance. It was old, the cover warped from humidity. The handwriting inside was neat but jagged in places, as if the writer's hand had trembled. The entries were dated from the early 1900s, written by someone named Captain Ellis Hargrove, the original lighthouse keeper. The first few pages were unremarkable, notes about the weather, ship sightings, and routine maintenance. But as I flipped further, the entries became strange. July 17, 1928. The tide is wrong. The sea moves as it pleases, as if it knows something I do not. A ship passed close to the rocks today, and the crew stared at the tower as if expecting someone to greet them. But I stayed inside. I've learned not to look too long at the waves. August 3, 1928. There is a voice in the fog. I hear it at night, whispering beneath the crash of the tide. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it knows my name. It asks me to come closer, to look deeper into the water. I resist, but it's getting harder every day. August 15, 1928. I made a mistake. I listened to the voice. I stood at the edge of the rocks and looked into the sea. There is something down there beneath the waves. It saw me, and now it wants something in return. The entry stopped abruptly after that. No farewell, no explanation, just silence. I shut the logbook and sat there for a while, my mind racing to make sense of it. It was easy to dismiss the writings as the ramblings of a lonely man who had spent too much time isolated by the sea. But something about his words clung to me, like a splinter lodged beneath my skin, small but impossible to ignore. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake in the small bed I dragged into the main room, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the windows. Around midnight, the tide rose and the waves pounded harder against the rocks below. I could have sworn I heard something in the distance, just a faint hum beneath the crash of water. It was probably nothing, just the sound of the ocean playing tricks on me. At least that's what I told myself as I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and waited for more. But deep down, I knew. I knew the ocean wasn't just water, and it wasn't done with this lighthouse. Not yet. Spoken in a low, unnerving tone. The next morning, I woke to find the shoreline completely submerged. The water had swallowed the rocks, and only a sliver of sand was still visible. It wasn't just a high tide. This was something else. The sea was inching closer every hour, as if it was creeping toward the lighthouse. Deliberately. I tried not to panic, convincing myself it had to be an unusual tide pattern. But deep down, I knew better. Both Ellis and O'Hara had written about the ocean moving like this. Purposeful, relentless. And both of them had left in a hurry, as if they knew something I didn't. With nothing else to do, I spent most of the day outside, trying to secure the path leading up to the lighthouse. I stacked some driftwood along the edges, hoping to stop the water from creeping further inland. It felt like a useless effort, but doing something helped keep me sane. As I worked, I found something strange, half buried in the sand. A metal box, rusted at the edges, but still intact. It was heavy, the kind of thing that looked like it had been sitting at the bottom of the ocean for a long, long time. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open. Inside was a collection of old, water-stained papers, maps, sketches, and a series of letters addressed to Captain Ellis Hargrove. The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone in a hurry. The letters were full of warnings. Warnings about the sea, about keeping the light on, about never ignoring the tide. One sentence stood out, circled in dark ink. The light is not just a beacon, it is a boundary. Without it, they will cross. They. I sat on the rocks for a long time, reading and rereading those words. The letters didn't explain what Ellis had seen beneath the water, but they made one thing clear. The lantern wasn't just meant to guide ships, it was meant to keep something in the ocean from reaching the shore. And I had let it go dark. That evening, I tried one last time to fix the lantern. I climbed back up to the top of the tower, wrench in hand, determined to get the gears moving again. But no matter how much I tinkered, the old mechanism refused to budge. It was as if the entire lighthouse had been waiting for this moment, for the light to fail and for the tide to rise. As the sun began to set, I noticed something odd out on the horizon, a strange, dark shape bobbing just beneath the surface of the water. It wasn't a ship. It was too low and too still. At first, I thought it might be driftwood or debris, but as the light faded, I realized the shape was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it was coming toward the shore. My chest tightened as I watched the dark shape inch closer, carried on the rising tide. It looked like a mass of tangled shadows, shifting and undulating just beneath the surface. I couldn't make out any details, only the sense that whatever it was, it didn't belong on this side of the water. I ran back down the staircase, nearly slipping on the worn steps, and threw open the front door. The ocean had already reached the base of the lighthouse, lapping at the rocks like a hungry thing. And just beyond the water's edge, I saw something glinting in the sand, a second pocket watch, identical to the one I'd found earlier. I picked it up, my hand shaking slightly, and turned it over. The same initials, EH. But this time, there was something else scratched into the back. Time's up. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door behind me as the tide rose higher. The waves crashed against the walls of the lighthouse, sending sprays of salt water through the cracks. I could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the windows as if the sea itself was calling for someone or something to return. I stood in the middle of the room, the pocket watch clenched in my hand, trying to make sense of it all. Ellis's warnings, O'Hara's journal, the strange letters, they all pointed to one thing. The lighthouse needed a keeper, and the ocean wouldn't stop until it had one. That's when I heard it, the low rhythmic hum beneath the sound of the waves. It wasn't a voice exactly, but a kind of pulse, like the beat of a distant drum. It filled the room, vibrating through the walls, as if the lighthouse itself was resonating with the sound. I knew, without a doubt, that the sea was waiting. And it was waiting for me. The hum from the walls didn't stop. It got louder, deeper, until it felt like the very foundation of the lighthouse was vibrating. I tried to steady myself, but it was like standing on a boat in the middle of a storm. The sound wasn't random. It was steady, rhythmic, like the slow beat of a drum, echoing from deep beneath the sea. I didn't know how to stop it. There was no switch to flip, no circuit to reconnect. All I had was the old lantern, broken and rusted, and the growing knowledge that something old and patient was expecting me to finish what Ellis and O'Hara couldn't. I climbed back to the lantern room, hoping that maybe somehow I could force it to light. I grabbed the wheel and twisted with all my strength, my hands slipping on the rusted metal. At first, it didn't move, but then, with a loud metallic groan, the gears shifted. Slowly, painfully, the ancient mechanism began to turn. I could feel the weight of it, the resistance, like the lighthouse itself didn't want to wake up. But I kept turning the wheel, inch by inch, until the lens started to rotate. A soft click echoed through the room, and for a brief moment, the lantern flickered to life, casting a weak amber glow through the fogged windows. Relief washed over me. I thought, just for a second, that maybe I had done it. Maybe the light was enough to push back whatever was stirring beneath the water. But then, the glow sputtered and went out. I froze, my hand still on the wheel, as the room plunged back into darkness. Outside, the waves crashed harder against the walls, and the low hum grew louder, almost deafening. I knew then that the light alone wasn't enough. The lighthouse wasn't just waiting for someone to fix the lantern. It was waiting for something far more important. It was waiting for a keeper. I stumbled back down the spiral staircase, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Both Ellis and O'Hara had left before the tide could take them, abandoning their posts. But now the lighthouse had a new owner, and the sea wouldn't be denied a second time. I reached the base of the tower just as the waves breached the front door, spilling cold water across the floor. The sound of the tide filled the room, a heavy, rolling roar that drowned out everything else. I could feel the pressure in the air shift, as if the very ocean was breathing down my neck. And then, in the dim light of the storm, I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the open door. It wasn't human, but it wore the shape of one, cloaked in shadow and seawater. Its form shifted and swayed with the rhythm of the waves as if it were part of the ocean itself. I couldn't make out a face, just the vague outline of a man standing perfectly still at the water's edge. It didn't move toward me. It didn't threaten me. It just stood there, waiting, as if it had all the time in the world. And in that moment, I understood. The lighthouse didn't just need a keeper, it demanded one. And when the lantern went out, someone had to take the place of those who had left. Someone had to stay. I don't know how I knew, but I did. It was the same knowledge that had driven Ellis to write those final desperate words, the same knowledge that had made O'Hara flee into the night, never to return. I was the new keeper, and the sea wanted me to stay. I stood there, ankle deep in seawater, my heart pounding, as the figure at the door slowly turned away. It didn't say anything, it didn't need to. The message was clear, the tide had come for its keeper. And now that I was here, it would leave me in peace, for now. The water began to recede, pulling back from the doorway and down the rocky path as if the ocean itself was retreating. The lighthouse groaned under the shifting pressure, settling back into its old, familiar silence. I knew what I had to do. I climbed the spiral staircase one last time, wrench in hand, and forced the lantern back into motion. It took hours of scraping rust, tightening bolts, cursing under my breath, but eventually the gears turned freely again, and the light flickered to life. This time, it stayed on. The lens rotated slowly, casting a warm, golden glow out over the dark water. I watched as the light swept across the waves, steady and sure, like a heartbeat. And just like that, the tide was quiet again. I stayed in the lighthouse after that, not because I had to, but because I knew it was where I belonged. The auction might have sold me a haunted lighthouse, but it had also given me something I hadn't realized I was looking for, a purpose. The ocean never really stopped calling. Every now and then, late at night, I'd hear that low hum beneath the waves, as if the sea was reminding me of the deal that had been made. But as long as the lantern stayed lit, the tide stayed where it belonged, just out of reach. I still have the pocket watches, both of them. I keep them on the mantle, side by side, a reminder of the ones who came before me and the ones who will come after. Because one day the light will go out again, and when it does, the sea will come looking for its keeper.